What happens when the weapons that shaped the last generation of warfare are no longer enough for the next? Welcome to the ISR Debrief. I'm Wesley Rose, your host. Today, I'll be joined by two leaders who have spent decades helping answer that very question. Leading today's discussion is our very own Chad Hartman, Senior Vice President of Global ISR Solutions at Integrity ISR and a retired United States Air Force intelligence colonel. During his 30-year career, Chad served in senior intelligence and targeting leadership roles, including as NATO's Targeting and Collection Management Authority. Joining Chad is retired United States Air Force Colonel Tom Dobbs, who spent 33 years leading intelligence organizations across the Pacific, Europe, Africa, and the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency. Chad and Tom have served together throughout their careers, bringing firsthand operational expertise from two of the world's most strategically important theaters. Together, they examine what the NATO summit means for the future of coalition warfare, why Ukraine is manufacturing Patriot missiles, how autonomous systems are changing the battlefield, and why artificial intelligence may become the most decisive capability of the next generation of conflict. Here's episode 2 of the ISR Debrief.
Hey, welcome to the ISR Debrief. Man, we got a great show for you today. We brought in a phenomenal guest, if you will, that we're going to get into some of the subject material. And Tom, it's so great to have you here.
Thanks, Chad. I appreciate you having me here, and it's a privilege.
Let's jump right into it. A lot of news came out of this week when we saw at the NATO summit. I think probably the one that's the most popular, the one that's resonated the most with folks out there is the President Trump announcing that the U.S. is reportedly going to authorize the licensing of Patriot missiles, production of those missiles, and actually in Ukraine. And just a little background for the folks out there and looking at this. One of the key parts is everyone knows the Patriot missile system been around, kind of been a rock star for decades now when it comes to air defense and when it comes to integrated air and missile defense, and that latter being probably really important. That is something we've used a lot. There's some times, though, if you look at it, there's not a big supply of those systems out there right now. And I think that's one of the challenges we're having as we continue into this is, hey, you know what? We've actually had multiple longstanding operations going with Patriots being provided and used by the Ukrainians. And then you got the situation with Iran, and now we've had quite a depletion within the global stock, if you will. So I think you look at that. One of the things that stood out to me and a question I would have is, Ukraine has really ascended here in this last year to where they're kind of recognized as arguably one of the leaders when it comes to defending against some of these threats based on what they've been able to do against the threat coming out of Russia. So the question I have is, why are they going after the U.S. Patriot system now?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chad. And I think an additional question would be, and why is the U.S. doing this now and granting permission to manufacture them? So I'll touch on those one by one. To your first question as to why Ukraine is doing this now, Ukraine has wanted to do this from day one. They wanted to have access to U.S. Patriots with robust supply because one of the biggest threats facing them, and I hate to say just threat, it's something that has manifested itself for years now since the Russian invasion in 2022. But Ukraine really needs those assets to be able to counter the ballistic missiles that are doing grave damage and killing way too many service members and civilians in Ukraine. I think the change now is Ukraine actually being able to manufacture these assets themselves. I think there's two factors in play there. From the U.S. perspective, we are running lower than we would like to be on having our own Patriot stocks. So as we're supporting our own national security by countering the Russian threat through supporting Ukraine, that's great for Western interests, but it's less great for the stocks of a critical munition that we would need in our own conflict, should we get into another one, or if the current one with Iran should deepen. So for us to let Ukraine manufacture its own, it sort of outsources that, creates another supplier, and it takes a little bit of the demand off the U.S. Supply of a critical munition. From the Ukrainian perspective, they have been very innovative as they have adapted to conflict as their homeland is being attacked. They are now arguably the world's leader in unmanned aerial systems or autonomous systems. They've used them to great effect, and we're starting to see some not just tactical and operational things like hitting tactical targets, operational interdiction of supply coming into Ukraine to support the Russian forces, but they're hitting strategic targets. And I don't mean strategic targets like a command center that controls the whole Russian military, but they're having strategic effect by hitting Russian homeland targets, and not just in the border areas near Ukraine. They're going deep into Russia. They're hitting airfields. They're hitting cities. They're hitting refineries. And it's all happening front page news right in front of Russia's own citizens. So I think that's a big step up for Ukraine. And the time is right now as they're starting to gain momentum. The U.S. sees a need to temper the loss of its own patriots and also to reinforce success for Ukraine.
Well, that's still important. Really, the thing that's been problematic here recently for Ukraine has been the missile threat. And counter missile technology is pretty exquisite. In fact, it's going to take them a little bit to be able to spin up. So I think there's some limitations and challenges. But like you said at the beginning of this, I think the strategic implications, the strategic messaging is what's really important. Anything you want to amplify on that as far as this?
Yeah, just a couple of things. First thing, you mentioned the strategic messaging and putting pressure on Russia, on Putin in particular. He's facing some tough times now. That doesn't mean he's ready to collapse imminently or anything of that nature. But Ukraine is starting to ramp up the pressure, and they had done well early in the war, in about the second half of the first year of the war, or even in the second year of the war, where they made some pretty good battlefield gains that they later lost to Russian ground forces. But those were tactical gains and losses on the battlefield that most Russian citizens probably had little awareness of. But now when they're seeing it's in their backyard, literally in the city, they look out their window and they see massive smoke and flames from burning refineries and critical factories and things of that nature. I think that's a lot different. The second thing I'll touch on just briefly, and I think we may get into it later on in the discussion, there's always a lot of talk about the shiny object, the weapon system. It's the aircraft, it's the Patriot battery, it's the missile, it's the PAC-2 or the PAC-3. Those are all crucial assets, and they're critical to our success. They're critical for Ukraine. But those things have to operate in an ecosystem. The Army likes to use a term called .mil-PF. All those things need to come together. You know, how many schoolhouse classes of people have been through the U.S. Army school, learn how to be air defenders, and have been doing that for their whole career and operating that weapon system? What about the radar coverage? How do you get tipped and cued to the fact that there actually is something coming in? Now, the Patriot does have its associated radar systems, but as far as having that longer term notice that something is inbound, things of that nature are much more complex. And that's going to be something where the Ukrainians, even if they manufacture their own assets, they're going to require some U.S. assistance for the foreseeable future.
No, I agree. I think there's a little more to it than the actual missile, right? It's what it represents. I think that kind of leads to the second point that kind of came out of the news this week that we saw, that NATO has signed a letter of intent to actually do a collective purchase from some of its member nations to actually go after and buy the MQ-4, the Navy version of the Global Hawk, for a maritime domain awareness surveillance system. So for those who don't know what we're talking here, it's NATO's already purchased. They've had 5 Global Hawk systems that predominantly do synthetic aperture radar to be able to do some observations and moving target indication. They've had that for a number of years. They bought those years ago from the U.S., and then they've done a collective purchase and utilized them, actually pretty decent success over the years. Important players in the NATO enterprise. Now they're looking to augment them with 5 more, but these are a more enhanced version of those aircraft focused on a maritime mission set. What I wanted to ask you, Tom, and looking at it is, how do you see specifically, based on those capabilities, how is this acquisition going to potentially enhance or increase NATO's deterrence and defensive capabilities?
There's a long way to go. There's now new additional aircraft coming online for NATO. There will be new sensors with different capabilities, which means different type of training for the people who are doing the exploitation. That's a big thing. But I would also offer that these coalition nascent efforts we have. So, for example, you're very familiar during my time at U.S. Air Forces Europe, Air Forces Africa. In the A2 organization, the ISR Directorate, we had an entity called EPI, the European Partner Integration Enterprise. And what we would do is we would bring in allies not as a NATO package officially signed off by NATO, but from individual NATO and sometimes non-NATO countries that would come into our spaces and learn on real world missions. They would perform exploitation of collection that was happening somewhere either in the EUCOM AOR or in a different area of responsibility. So having something like that at scale, I think is what's going to be needed. Second thing I would say is the integration of all that into a common operational picture. You know, we always talk about the COP or even the SIP, the common intel picture, which isn't also common. You know, we have this version and that version and that version, sometimes even just within U.S. forces.
Right.
Now you have the 32 countries you talked
There's
about.
nothing common about the COP.
That's right. We do have all these NATO countries that need to come together and be able to not only see the data, but get the feeds in the speed of need to be able to make decisions and to employ and deliver effects.
This is a good example that we've talked about on this show before and everything about we're seeing the greatest change in the character of war that I think we've ever seen here in just the last few years. And so when you start looking at that and you start looking at what Ukraine and what we saw in Iran with just drones and swarms of cost-effective, cheap, huge masses of drones with incredible precision and resilience. Is this the right asset, right? Looking forward, this is a pretty hefty investment. Is this the right asset, even with all the good it brings for NATO? Or is it something they maybe need to refocus a little? Your thoughts?
I'll look at the audience and say, we did not pre-coordinate this, but this is kind of a softball in a way because I was wanting to kind of interject in your conversation and talk about that very thing. So both with the Ukrainian Patriots and with the MQ-4 Triton going to the NATO allies, they're great assets. They're capable assets. And when you build out that broader ecosystem that enables their operation and effective utilization, it's great. But I have to ask myself, are we really looking at the threat we faced over the last generation where you and I came up in a desert storm and then post-desert storm, and then increasing automation, increasing precision? That was like the big expansion of capability during our time frame. But I'm not sure a Patriot is going to help you against the unmanned and autonomous threat. And I'm just talking air threat. Then you have, maritime assets, as Ukraine is very effectively demonstrating. So when it comes to intelligence, and I'll say ISR more broadly, because it's not just the intelligence, it's ISR together because the intelligence comes from the fusion of what you collect from surveillance and reconnaissance. Being able to get that to where it needs to go, but then to have an effective decision maker do something with it and have the tools to do something with it. So I'm not certain that those are the optimized weapon systems with the MQ-4 and with the Patriot, but they certainly are needed, particularly with the Patriots in Ukraine. They're not buying them because it's trendy. They're buying them because they're getting hit pretty hard on a consistent basis by ballistic missiles.
No, I agree. I think these are good measures, but it does beg the question. I think, as you summed up there, are we buying the right stuff in the future fight, for the current fight, even in the future fight that's coming? So great transition to the next subject, because I think we get into kind of that arena.
We'll be right back with more of the ISR debrief. Today's episode is brought to you by ISR University.
What if your training actually prepared you for the mission? At ISR University, we deliver immersive training across space, intelligence, electronic warfare, and targeting, built for real-world operations. Choose from our growing online course catalog, or let us build a tailored in-person training solution for your team. Train smarter at isruniversity.com.
Welcome back to the ISR Debrief. Here's the rest of Chad Hartman's conversation with retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Tom Dobbs.
One of the news items that came out, and we didn't hear a lot about this, but it came out just shortly before the summit, is that we knew that NATO had already adopted the Palantir produced, NATO Maven smart system, and it just went FOC, apparently about 6 months early, according to the producers that are putting this out. So it's hit final operational capability 6 months ahead of schedule. Now, I'm a little suspect on that, but there's still goodness in this system. And what I think it represents, and just like you were talking about, this is the system for the current and the future fight. This is getting into artificial intelligence. This is getting into that ecosystem and bringing everybody together on the same page across all that different data and making it happen. One of the things I want to talk about, what is the biggest advantage, though, of this system for NATO in particular?
Yeah, that's a good and highly relevant question. I think this is starting to get after the thing I addressed with that broader enterprise, the broader ecosystem. You've got the shiny object. You've got an MQ-4 Triton flying. You have the other assets that are already existing. You have what the different partners and allies bring into the fight. And those were built by individual countries. So their infrastructure, their communication feeds, their command and control tends to be separate and distinct, not by design, but we need something that's going to bring all that together in a way that effectively utilizes all that data and operationalizes it to enable decisions and to allow us to deliver effects, whether that's putting munitions on target or some other type of effect. But I think the key is NATO now realizes that.
Yeah.
I will say it's only been a few years, since we were in Europe together, and you even more recently than I. And I think the leap that NATO is making forward is very encouraging. And just the fact that they're doing something tangible with a proven system, and I'll say proven in the sense it's delivering operational relevance. Maven Smart System is not perfect, but it's been demonstrated. And for them to jump on that bandwagon and do something that their larger U.S. ally is already doing, I think that's very encouraging. And again, like I said, with the other weapon systems we talked about, it'll take some time to develop tactics, techniques, procedures, to develop the training for people to do it. But I think it's very encouraging, and it can help the NATO allies. My biggest question will be, to what extent were those things thought of together?
Yeah.
Because I just spliced them together in a context of a conversation about airborne ISR and this integration and fusion. If that was NATO's plan and that's why they decided to buy these two capabilities, I think that's fantastic. I don't know whether that's the case or not, but either way, even if it wasn't, we're going to have to find a way to integrate those disparate capabilities. And when I say we, I mean NATO, the broader alliance, not the U.S.
I'll give the alliance a lot of credit. And I think, there was a lot of growing that took place the last decade, in particular for NATO and the headquarters and the different elements out there. I think one of the things you saw with them is it started off as a targeting of fires initiative. They want to be able to do coordinated fires. I think what they appreciated and learned quite quickly, and now has probably become just as important more, is how do I hunt before I actually kill? How do I actually coordinate the incredible hunt and the disparate systems out there to be able to fuse all that intelligence data together quickly and go through an amazing amount of information, but do it at the speed of need and be able to present those targetable solutions. They have really taken that on and appreciate that lesson. So I think there's goodness behind this that is really going to manifest itself. I think there's limitations, right? With everything, as we talked about with these other systems, I think some of the things people don't truly appreciate and understand, NATO is probably your quintessential bureaucratic environment. And it's not because there's any fault, it's just the nature of a 32 nation. And I think you have that as a vulnerability to risk. And I think that alliance has got to maybe look at how do I enhance and build the game up a little bit in that data and those resources so that you can really take advantage of the system.
That brings up a great point, Chad, because not only is there the effort to get the data where it needs to go for all the purposes we talked about, for C2, for delivering fires, that sort of thing. There's the process of, do you have the right pipes, if you want to call it that, the comm infrastructure to be able to get it from the right node to the right node. But all of that assumes a policy decision that said that's okay. Yeah. And what made me think of that is when you said it's too reliant on one nation, with the U.S. being that nation. I will say in the course of the conflict that developed in the first part of 2022, as Russia, ramped up its already conducted invasion of Ukraine and bit off another chunk, I saw some amazing things happen from a U.S. policy perspective. From the military side, on the Title 10 sort of nature of intelligence and information sharing, and on the Title 50 side governing the U.S. intel agencies. I saw agency directors and I saw senior officials in the Pentagon that were making really surprising decisions about giving away some very exquisite intelligence and being able to share it with the NATO allies. First of all, saying, hey, this is really going to happen. The Russians are about to invade. This isn't a feint. It's going to happen. And then as things started happening and unfolding, being able to share more and more layers of intelligence. I'm very proud of the role that you and I and our respective teams on the NATO side and on the US side were able to play to get NATO data to the US side, and probably more of the US side feeding into the NATO side. But all of that was based on decisions due to a sense of urgency that we needed to have a policy of more liberal sharing of information. I think that's critical. And here's where I'm going to shift gears a little bit and go to the other side of the world. Yeah. As you know, before I was the A2 in Europe, I had that role in the Pacific, which is where we first worked together. So when I was the PACAF A2, the director of ISR there, we didn't have a NATO alliance. We have really strong allies. We have the Republic of Korea. Yeah. We have Japan, and we have robust relationships with the two of them. And the two of them don't always necessarily get along very well due to World War II history and a bunch of other things that have happened over the years. So there's no trilateral infrastructure policy framework or anything else that would even allow those three countries to be integrated, even to the extent that NATO is. And then you add other key players in the region. You talk about Taiwan and even smaller partners, Philippines, Singapore, and other nations in that region. So what NATO lacks is well understood, but what they have is NATO has been a thing. It's been an entity for all these years. So on the positive definition of bureaucracy, which is structure and process and organization, they have that. We don't have that as a collective framework for what would absolutely be needed in the Pacific if war were to start between the U.S. and the People's Republic of China.
No, that's a great point. I mean, we lived it, right? We went through that, and I don't think people realize how many stovepipes there are in the Pacific, and how that NATO framework, just in of itself, is power, right? Even if it's complicated, it's bureaucratic, having that framework is all too important. We saw it a lot of times, I think, where we would provide you a lot of the intelligence, and we would get it from partners, but I would get it from this nation, and I couldn't share it with this nation, which meant I couldn't share it with any other nation. And so we would have to kind of figure out how we play this complex game of masking the sources on some of this and putting it out. And I think that is a huge advantage I think the European theater and NATO has over the Pacific.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We've talked a lot of material here, a lot of great discussion, and a lot of great, covered a lot of developments that took place this week. We like to, on this show, kind of wrap it up and go, hey, what's your final point? What's the bottom line looking here? So when we talk about NATO, we talk about where they are and where they're going. What do you think is the most important thing, the one single thing as you look forward?
I'm going to cheat. I'm going to say 1A and 1B.
Okay.
It's a tough question, but I think when you look at automation and how it's driving all the things we talked about. So you have the broader ecosystem of the command and control and the sensors and the radars and delivering effects where they need to be, but there's all that stuff that needs to link them together with the data. But more and more now, things are being automated. And that's great. Automation is great because it speeds things up. But I would say there's also a cautionary tale because it's already starting to happen, but we're going to see more and more that as things get automated, life and death kill decisions are going to be automated. We already know that there can't be a human in the loop on everything, but we've always said, well, we need the human on the loop to have the ethical, moral, common sense judgment that's going to guide and give the final thumbs up or thumbs down. I would offer that that's going away fast. And we haven't built an ethical and a policy framework to be able to deal with that. I think it can be a powerful and effective thing, and it'd be the greatest thing that the U.S. has in its arsenal for warfare. But if that gets off the leash and we don't have responsible and ethical AI usage, that could be tough. So we talked a lot about airplanes and missiles and launchers and all that sort of stuff. So hardware is really important. But I'd say the trend in hardware is it's going to cheap and expendable. The Army, the U.S. Army, to a large extent, is saying, give me something I can use for the next 9 months. And we're going to burn through a bunch of those UAVs or UASs, however we're calling them today. And then in 9 months, there will be something new because somebody's developed something. So we don't want to build 1 million of them yet.
Right.
So I think the AI is way more important than hardware. And I didn't think I would ever say that. The second thing we didn't talk about, and I'll only say the subject because it would be a whole other show. I think space is critical to all that. it's not just the sensing from space and the communications and the PNT, the position, navigation, and timing. All of that is important. It's always been important. But we're now starting to hear people talking in a serious way about having data centers in orbit. So when you talk about AI, now it's taken one more step out of the loop, if we ever get to that, where it shortens the chain and it makes things less vulnerable here on Mother Earth, where a big, massive data center can be easily targeted by a ballistic missile, an aircraft, UAV, or anything else. So that's my 1A and 1B. It's the data and AI, and then the role that space plays in that.
No, hey, those are great points. I think you're onto it. I think you're absolutely right that it would be a whole different show to talk about not just the increased dependency, but the opportunity that space provides. I think NATO's making some strides there, but that's something I think we'll save for another show and get into that, because I think they're in the nascent stages and really taking off. I will say, in kind of summarizing all this, I think we did a good job when we've gone through and we've talked about the hardware and the software. A lot of times people will pair off the hardware with the software. I think the other dimension, and you've noted this in that ecosystem discussion there, is don't forget about the human, right? I think sometimes we get fixated on this, on what we're going to do, whether it be drones or it be as a material solution or the software, the AI, and how that comes in. And I'll tell you, that human machine interface, that tradecraft mastering of the human to be able to leverage these systems. Because honestly, we're doing AI not to replace humans per se. We're doing AI to be able to enhance the human nature of warfare and what we do. So I think that's an important dimension as we go forward. Been great talking with you. I really appreciate it. I think it was a great week for the news we see out there. Hopefully we'll see some of this continue to develop, and more importantly, I really appreciate it, Tom.
Thanks a lot, Chad.
Thanks, buddy.
Great working with you as always.
All right.
Thanks for joining us for episode 2 of the ISR Debrief. If you found today's discussion valuable, be sure to subscribe so you never miss future conversations with the experts shaping intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, space, electronic warfare, and targeting. The ISR Debrief is produced by Integrity ISR, with education and professional development powered by ISR University. Whether you're beginning your career or advancing your expertise, ISR University provides instructor-led and self-paced courses developed by experienced practitioners across ISR, space, electronic warfare, targeting, and professional development. Our programs are designed to help individuals, organizations, and government agencies build mission-ready knowledge for today's evolving operational environment. To learn more about our courses and professional pathways, visit isruniversity.com. I'm Wesley Rose. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you right here next time on the ISR Debrief.